Welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's Curators Corner. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. Before we start, I have a couple of things that I always say, and I will say them again. One is that I want to emphasize that our building is open to the public. So I hope that you'll be inspired by this program or by some of our other programs to come and look at the objects that I've been talking about or will talk about and see them in person in our museum. We're open Monday through Friday from 10 to 4:30 and on Saturday and Sunday from 12 to 4. Although actually today and tomorrow we're closed for the period from 1 to 3, just we're having some staff training. Okay, the other thing I always want to mention, if you'd like to arrange a guided tour of our museum, please just give us a call a week in advance and we'll try and set that up. And finally, I want to encourage you to pose any questions that you've got during my program in the Q&A feature of Zoom, and I'll make sure to look at them when I'm finished talking. The other thing I wanted to say is to mention the Buy a Brick campaign that we have started, where you can help HMTC and honor a family member or someone special through the placement of a personalized brick in the restored patio that we are putting in overlooking our children's memorial garden. I think an email is going out about this shortly, but if you have questions, you can always reach out to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. And I'll add that if you are interested in sponsoring one of HMT's public program series, please reach out to our development director, Gail Peck, at the number there. Okay, I won't push further on the funding at this point, but I hope that's something you'll consider. Today, I'd like to talk about these two campaign posters, which we show in our second gallery. Both of these were used by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in 1932, actually in the spring of 1932. I had initially thought they were both from the same election, from Adolf Hitler's presidential campaign, but on closer inspection, actually, one is from that presidential campaign, but the other was from the Nazi effort to win seats in the 1932 Prussian state elections. But both are reminders of the large popular appeal of Hitler and the Nazi Party in the early 1930s. When people talk about Hitler's rise to power in 1933, when he was named chancellor, and this is one of the iconic images that the Nazis used to highlight that takeover of power, I hear it often emphasized that Hitler was not elected to office, and that's completely true. He was not elected. But when people say that, they often suggest that somehow Hitler forced himself into power or took power through force, and that is not the case. Hitler was appointed chancellor in January of 1933 because of the success of the Nazi Party in the Prussian elections in April of 1932, the German federal elections in November of 32, and because of Hitler's own popular appeal as seen in the 1932 German presidential election. You will recall that in the wake of Germany's defeat in World War I, the Kaiser abdicated and Germany adopted a new constitution written in the city of Weimar. And that established a Germany as a democracy. The Weimar Constitution created a government with three main components: the parliament, the Reichstag, where representatives from electoral districts came together to draft laws based on majority rule. There was also a president who served a 7-year term and was elected through a national vote, who signed those bills into law, handled foreign affairs, oversaw the military, and named the chancellor. And the chancellor was that third component of the governing system. The chancellor's role was to lead the government and represent the majority party in the Reichstag. It sounds pretty straightforward, but the new democratic form of government had, from the very beginning in 1919, many doubters in Germany. There was a long history of a monarchy. Suddenly, this new form of government came into force. Indeed, in 1925, when Paul von Hindenburg, the former commander of the German military in World War I, won Germany's presidency, many of his supporters in 1925 thought he would overthrow the Weimar Constitution and return the country to a monarchy. They thought that in part because in that election, Hindenburg ran against Wilhelm Marx, who had served as the chancellor for the previous 2 years and was supported by the parties who had drafted the Weimar Constitution in 1918. So Hindenburg was running against the groups that had created the Weimar Constitution. In addition, it was known that before Hindenburg agreed to run in 1925, he had gotten the endorsement of the Kaiser. So he had the support of the previous monarch. Once in power, however, Hindenburg pledged to support the Constitution and had sustained the Weimar government. Still, Hindenburg served as president during a tumultuous time, particularly after the 1929 stock market crash in New York that led to a global depression. In Germany, unemployment spiked after 1929. There was a run on the banks in Germany, and the economic chaos of the early 1920s, right in the wake of the Versailles Treaty when there had been hyperinflation, that seemed to be reappearing, and many in Germany were very concerned about the dangers of financial economic chaos returning. That economic pressure had two significant consequences in German politics. First, as the conditions in Germany deteriorated, divisions in the Reichstag grew to the point that in 1930, the existing chancellor, who I show here, Heinrich Brüning, was no longer able to form a majority coalition. No group of parties in the Reichstag were able to come to agreement about how to rule or who should be in control. Each party appears to have felt that if they could not control the Reichstag, then nobody should. And with no majority rule in the Reichstag, Brüning relied on a provision in the Weimar Constitution that allowed for the president to rule by decree. So by 1930, 3 years before Hitler comes to power, democracy had collapsed in Germany. Elected officials were no longer passing the laws. Instead, the legislative power had been handed over to the president, to the executive. In this case, to Paul von Hindenburg. The second significant consequence of the economic conditions after 1929 was a dramatic rise in support for the Nazi Party. In the Reichstag elections held in May of 1928, before the stock market crash fell, the Nazi Party received just 2.8% of the vote. That's a national vote. So it was a fringe party. 12 seats out of the 491 in the Reichstag were held by the Nazi Party. Their calls for the end or the repeal of the Versailles Treaty and the blaming of Jews and communists for Germany's troubles just largely fell on deaf ears in 1928. But 2 years later, after the stock market crash, when new elections were held in September of 1930, the Nazi Party message resonated in a way never seen before, and the party gained almost 20% of the total national vote. They went from 12 seats in the Reichstag to 107. So with that background, let's look a little bit closer at those two posters from 2 years after the Nazi electoral victories of 1930, the ones from 1932. The first, as I said, is not from the presidential campaign, but from the April 1932 elections in the Prussian parliament. Prussia, as you may know, was one of the states in Germany, in Weimar Germany, but it was by far the largest state. It included more than 60% of the country's territory, and you can see here it's marked in white. It also had more than 60% of the population in Prussia and included the federal capital of Berlin. And so you see here the map of these German states, and you get a sense of how dominant Prussia was to the nation of Germany. In April of 1932, there was election of the Prussian parliament, which had been governed by the same coalition that had dominated in the Reichstag since 1919, made up of the Social Democratic Party, the Center Party, and the German Democratic Party. So these were the parties that had dominated in the democratic era of the Weimar Constitution and had been supporters of that. All 423 seats in the Prussian parliament were up for re-election in that April of 1932. 4 years earlier, in the previous state elections of 1928, the Nazi Party had, much like in the Reichstag elections of that same year, won less than 2% of the vote. But in April of 1932, as you can see in this poster, the Nazi Party promoted itself as the party of work, freedom, and bread. The reference to List 8 being the list of the Nazi Party candidates on the ballot. The message in the poster is strong and direct, much like the strong farmer depicted, with blonde hair, a sharp jaw, and he's planting seeds. The Nazis, according to the poster, would put people back to work during a time when almost a quarter of Germany's population was out of work. They also promoted the idea that the Nazis would end food insecurity, end the bread lines, end hunger. The freedom component of the slogan was a bit more vague. On the one hand, the message referred to the Nazi plan to provide freedom from the economic suffering, the freedom from want that Franklin Delano Roosevelt would tout several years later as part of his 4 Freedoms speech. So it's freedom from want, freedom from economic suffering, but the Nazi freedom also referred to freedom from the grip of the Versailles Treaty that the Nazis harped on as undermining the country. And although less clearly stated in this campaign, was also a reference to freeing true Germans from the problems caused by Jews and communists and outsiders. In 1932, however, the main push of the Nazi Party in Prussia did not highlight anti-Semitism. There were few, if any, references to the party's brutal support for law, order, and racial purity. Instead, the campaign deceptively focused on economic issues, promoting the idea that the Nazis would provide jobs and food. And that message was highly successful. The Nazi Party, with this campaign, won 36% of the seats in the Prussian parliament, the largest of any party in that election. So more than a third of Prussia voted for Nazi candidates. Equally stunning in that election was the loss of support for the previously dominant coalition that lost its majority, the coalition that had been in power since the Weimar Constitution was drafted. In the end, though, the electoral victory of the Nazi Party in Prussia was quickly eclipsed by the rise of the Nazi Party in the Reichstag and the elevation of Adolf Hitler to national power after January of 1933. And then Hitler went on to dissolve the federal structure of Germany. Still, the poster, I think, highlights the deceptive image used by the Nazi Party to promote itself a year before Hitler was elevated into power as the chancellor. The other poster is from Adolf Hitler's personal presidential campaign run, which took place in March of 1932, a month before the Prussian parliamentary election that the other poster is part of. By March of 1932, when the presidential election took place in Germany, the Nazi Party was firmly established and had a firmly established political network all across Germany. They'd run a full slate of candidates 4 years earlier in both the federal and Prussian state elections, and they were in the midst of a major campaign in the 1932 Prussian parliament elections. By the time of the 1932 presidential campaign, Hitler also knew all too well how much power the president wielded, having watched President Hindenburg rule by decree in the Reichstag for the previous 2 years. Hindenburg, who I show here a few years earlier, was 84 years old in 1932. He was not eager to run again, but he was convinced by various supporters that he was the only person who could assure a defeat of Hitler, who Hindenburg had come to fear and dislike. He held a few radio speeches, Hindenburg did, and a small number of social gatherings, but Hindenburg left most of the campaigning to others. He appeared to be content to ride on his reputation and believed that Germans would not support the radical Adolf Hitler, who had sought to overthrow the government of Germany by force just 9 years earlier in Munich with the Munich uprising. Hitler, who knew that it was a big challenge to unseat Hindenburg, mounted a vigorous campaign in 1932 using carefully crafted public appearances, radio speeches, and a massive poster campaign. Even if he lost, Hitler felt that his active campaigning would only help the Prussian state elections that were going to take place shortly after the presidential campaign and any other future Reichstag election that might happen where the Nazis were going to run. The poster we show like the one used in the Prussian parliament elections, deceptively promoted Hitler as focused on economic issues, eliding or hiding his hateful message about Jews. The poster shows a family with a woman in the dominant position and with a somewhat masculine face. Her husband is dejected and beaten down. And the children, if you look closely at the children's faces, particularly the older child, they seem to be looking with a certain disparagement at their father. And the message, I think, is pretty clear. With millions of men out of work and with children suffering under the economic hardships, only Hitler could save the German family. He would restore men to their dominant position in the family. He would make children look up to their fathers again. Our poster has men and women mentioned in the top, but other versions of this same poster were printed with just Frauen at the top, just women. But either way, whether it had men and women or just women on the top, the message was to all voters. And I'll just mention that women were voters in Germany. They had won the right to vote with the Constitution of the Weimar Republic in 1919. I'd like to share two other posters from Hitler's campaign that we don't actually show in our museum. This is one of them, and it also, as you can see, focuses on economic issues, appealing to Germans left unemployed and destitute by the Great Depression, and claiming that Hitler was their savior, their last hope. And you can see the images of the gray masses of workers who were unemployed and struggling with eyes darkened, but Hitler was their savior. This was the message that Hitler promoted. The other poster I want to show is probably the most well-known poster from the campaign. It is notable both for its strong portrayal of Hitler, but also the largely lack of any particular message. It simply promoted Hitler as strong and decisive, a man who could get the country moving again, but with no slogan, no message, just his name. And for comparative purposes, this is one of the more well-known posters issued by Hindenburg's campaign in 1932, also strikingly simple, with only the words "with him." It suggested through the handshake, though, that Hindenburg was willing to work with various parties to unite the nation. Remember, this is a time when the Reichstag is completely divided, not able to create a majority. So he says he can unite people. But Hindenburg's age, I think, is notable, particularly when compared with Hitler's youthful image from his poster. And the clear, sharp poster of Adolf Hitler also contrasted to the blurry vagueness of the Hindenburg poster. In the 1932 presidential election, Hitler did better than expected, winning 11 million votes and some 30% of the total. Hindenburg did better, winning 18 million, but he just barely missed the needed 50% of the vote to prevent a runoff. Instead, his 49.5% meant that a second election needed to be held a month later. It was held on April 10th of 1932. And in that second round of elections, only the top three vote getters were on the ballot: Hindenburg, Hitler, and Ernst Thälmann, the leader of the German Communist Party, who'd won about 5 million votes in the first election, about 13% of the total population, of the total vote. More than 2.6 million other votes were up for grabs in the second election from candidates who did not make the top three. Given the numbers, it would have been unlikely for Hitler to have gained enough votes to displace Hindenburg, particularly since he was not expecting to win over any of the Communist Party supporters. And thus, the final results, Hindenburg won 53% of the second vote and secured a victory. Still, Hitler won over 13 million votes in the second round, polling more than a third of the nation. And you'll notice that Hitler won more votes, he gained more votes in the second election than Hindenburg. It just wasn't enough. In the wake of Hitler's defeat, however, Hitler did not stop campaigning, moving on a few months later to campaign for the Nazi Party candidates in the July Reichstag elections. And here I want to show you a clip from his campaigning for the July 1932 Reichstag elections. And I want you to take note of the pageantry in this clip that I'm going to show you. It's about a minute long. That would be further expanded on when Hitler came to power a year later with music, a parade of flag bearers, and a massive crowd. And then also take note of the words Hitler uses. Okay, let me see if I can make this happen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. And here we go. It looks very much like the Nazi party rallies that would come after Hitler got into power.
Jahre lang haben diese Parteien die deutsche Freiheit vergewaltigt, den deutschen Menschen geknebelt und geschlagen. 2 oder 3 Monate vergangen sind, wird euer Terror beseitigt sein. So wahr wir Nationalsozialisten.
Okay, I'm going to stop that and go back to my PowerPoint. Well, anyway, I hope that that was interesting. I really am struck by that kind of campaigning that we see in that clip because it's so much like what we would see later on. And you hear the language from Hitler there, where it's aggressive language referring to the existing parties having raped German freedom and referring to German men being beaten with clubs, referring to some of the political fighting that had taken place in the streets in Germany in the previous years. But he says voting for National Socialism will remove this terror. His language is bellicose and angry, but like in the posters, there is a high level of deception, claiming that the parties currently in power had created the terror and making no reference to his own plans to use terror to his own advantage. With Hitler's active campaigning, the Nazi Party won 37% of the vote in the July Reichstag elections, the largest vote of any party. And it was in the wake of that election that Hindenburg's new chancellor, Franz von Papen, who had very little political experience, began to think that Hitler could be used and controlled. Papen went on to dissolve the Reichstag and held new elections in November, where the Nazis actually lost a couple of seats, but remained the most dominant party in the Reichstag. And when Papen was forced out of power, he urged Hindenburg to bring Hitler in as the new chancellor. Again, believing that Hindenburg and Papen could manipulate Hitler and get him to do what they wanted. Papen and Hindenburg were wrong, we know, very wrong. Within a month of being named chancellor, Hitler was able to secure emergency power that enabled him to crack down on his opposition and then gain dictatorial control. He was finally able to secure the power that he had hoped to win in the 1932 presidential campaign. It had not come through the democratic process, although he had tried that route just a year earlier. Instead, it came through the careful manipulation of Hindenburg and through a series of unforeseen events like the Reichstag fire. But Hitler's rise to power was also made possible by the carefully crafted and deceptive image that he had used in the earlier campaigns, which are highlighted through these posters. So I will stop there. Thank you for watching. If you have questions, please use the Q&A window to type those in. I want to, before I get to answering those, I just want to put in a plug for some of our other upcoming programs. Tomorrow evening, my colleague, Avi Markowitz, the new Director of Education here at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, will be joining me for a virtual tour through our galleries. We haven't offered one of these in a while, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion with Avi about our museum and the things that he takes away from walking through it. So I hope you'll be interested in joining us for that. And then on Sunday evening, we are having the next session in our series about Sunday with Survivors, and this one with Mireille Taub, a Holocaust survivor who's going to talk about both her and her late husband's experiences in France during the Holocaust. And one last program to mention, I will be back for my next Curator's Corner next Wednesday, when I'll be talking about an exhibition created by the Nazis for what they called degenerate music. As always, you can find more information about these programs, a full list of our schedule, on our website at www.hmtcli.org under the events tab. And I also hope you'll go to that website, make a donation, or reach out to us if you'd be interested in sponsoring one of our public program series. Okay, let me just see if there are any questions in the Q&A box, see if anything's come up. But I really want to thank you for joining me this morning and look forward to seeing you at some of our other programs soon. Have a good morning, everybody. Take care.